Okay, let's get on with it, and I'll
Perfect.
fly through it real quickly. Um, you guys were nice enough to introduce yourselves, and some of you who don't know me, very quickly. This is who I am, and sort of why I'm here. Um, I am a mariner, and I run a company of mariners. My expertise has brought me over the last 40 years very firmly into the field of ice navigation. Um, Getting my experience commercially and in the Canadian Coast Guard at icebreakers. I'm an ice pilot slash ice navigator with a team of more than 24 around the world that work through Martech Polar. Um, I was brought in, headhunted in to author Transport Canada's Ice Navigator Standards in the mid 1990s, which was to be the basis of what was then envisioned the first time as a polar code. I have continued on working with Ice Navigator Standards, either with Transport Canada, Coast Guard, or internationally. And went on to write the Nautical Institute's Guide for Polar Operations, which is available in its second edition now and has just been Spanish. I'm the Nautical Institute subject matter expert and delegate to IMO and other ice navigation related fora for ice navigation and polar operations, and I'm a past president of the Nautical Institute. One of the things I want to do with you is to do a bit of a close the gap on the hyperbole and the clickbait headlines that we often see based on what it takes to go through the polar regions. It's likely going to be a little bit more focused on the Arctic than the Antarctic, but I want you to get that feeling that that they're a little bit different, but a lot the same. So, absolutely, the polar regions are changing. And it is so important to understand that the headlines out there are often clickbait, and they give the wrong impression of how much is changing, what the risks are. There are thousands of armchair pundits who dive in every year at the beginning of the Arctic season or at the beginning of the Antarctic season, when the New York Times or the Guardian blasts out their seasonal headlines. Ice-free summers, yada yada yada. Northwest Passage, Northern Sea Route are open to business. Well, there's some practical realities around it, so we're going to look at some of that and dispel some of the myths and talk about some of the practical implications that you guys are going to see. This is it. This is what it's all about. No matter what the headlines are saying, ice is still an issue, and it's going to be an issue for decades to come. And we'll go into that a little bit more detail as we go. One of the biggest myths that we get out there is that Northwest Passage, Northern Sea Route are becoming Arctic highways. They aren't. There is an incremental increase in traffic, but transits, which is actually going the full length of either the NSR or the NWP, they're not increasing at a very high rate. Where we're talking to the super yacht sector, we're seeing more there because conditions are getting somewhat more benign. The frightening part is we're seeing them come ill-prepared. Most of the voyages commercially are still expeditionary. They're trying them out. There have been a number that have been going through over the last few years that have increased in a slow rate. But where we're seeing the biggest increase in Arctic shipping in particular is in the destinational stuff, the stuff that comes in and goes out, particularly around the Russian exploration for hydrocarbon work and export. In Canada, a huge tonnage increase overnight occurred when Baffinland began exporting iron ore in 70,000 ton ships. But the most interesting one is the community resupply throughout the Arctic, whether it be Russia, Alaska, Canada, or Greenland for that matter. As communities are slowly growing and their need for subsistence and everybody wants a 70-inch color TV now, the cargo is increasing. So that's where we're seeing the biggest numbers coming up. Now, hope that this is going to show us a little bit of what we deal with on the Arctic. This is a little dated, but it shows the annual progression of ice through the Arctic, and you'll notice that it does that clockwise movement. That's called the Beaufort Gyre, and the biggest thing to notice about that is that whenever there's ice, it's still held against the Canadian archipelago. It's clearing off the northern side more effectively than, or the northern searoute side than it is on our side. So in Canada, if there's any ice, we're going to see it. The pack is changing. Absolutely, there is less polar pack and less multi-year ice, particularly in the center of the Arctic. The Antarctic is mostly impacted by large glacial ice, the massive tabular bergs. There has been some decrease in the annual ice growth and rot out, but it's not as it's not as changing as much as the calving off of large massive icebergs. Interestingly, with global climate change, the icebergs that are generated in Baffin Bay and Davis Strait are increasing. Climate change is causing the glaciers to move more quickly and calve off much more. The other piece that we have to take into consideration is that conditions are changing constantly. And we have to be aware of that. Just because it was good last year doesn't mean it's going to be good this year. And that's exactly what we're looking at in a couple of the projects that we're doing. The bottom line is the area remains ice covered for 8 to 9 months of the year. So when we look at the numbers, it's pretty clear. And I'll say right out, I am not a climate change disbeliever. I believe in it. All of us believe it at Martech Polar. We see it all the time. We see the effects. It's changing. But in behind that, we have to understand that we've known basically since the 1700s that there are several underlying cycles of good and bad ice years. In fact, a 50-year cycle, an 11-year cycle. Like anything that's in the natural environment, it isn't hard and fast, 50 and 11, but that's a rough pair of different cycles. The 11-year cycle might be related to sunspot activity. We don't know, but we know that we can get every 11 years, there's going to be a better series of ice years. Every 50 years, there's going to be a better series of ice years. And when they come together at the same time, we get really good ice years. So what do we mean by a good ice year? That's a year with little ice, as opposed to bad ice year where there's a chunk of ice. So when we often see people looking at averages, like even just the 1991 to 2020 that we see here, it's a very short period of time to make any sort of solid prognostication. Yes, it's decreasing, but if you look at the black line there, that is an average over that period, 1991 to 2020, that it shows us that it's only incremental. That though we've had that 2012 year, there's years that bounce back, and that's what we have to be aware of as we travel from year to year. So some of the challenges that we're going to be facing, and then if I look to the super yacht community in particular, is in a regulatory environment. There's winters with less ice. The variability is daily, it's weekly, it's monthly, it's annually. But as long as there is ice, it will be a hazard to shipping. And the prevailing currents, as long as it's there, as I showed in that short video, it will move against and into the Canadian archipelago. We know that thinner, less compact ice is more prone to faster drift and heavier deformation. So we're seeing ridged ice in places that we didn't see it before. We're also seeing multi-year ice into the southern parts of the Canadian archipelago where we never saw it before. When the pack was solid multi-year, there were large areas that locked the ice and it didn't move into the archipelago. Well, now in the middle of the summer, we're seeing ice where we never saw it before because it's bigger, heavier, thicker ice, and it's been able to move into an area that you might have thought ice-free. These are typical shots. I always like to use these because that 2012 one makes it look like there is absolutely no ice in the Canadian Arctic, and that is not the case. And these are the kind of shots that we see being used by an awful lot of popular media. It's a typical image. It's based on what we call passive microwave sensors, but they do not indicate a navigational hazard extent. They're fine for trending, for climate research, but not for navigation. The climate researcher looks with an interpretation saying ice-free in a climate sense means less than 15% covered by ice. Well, that can make or break a voyage. For us, ice-free is ice-free, less than 1% ice. So how we define these things and move ahead, either climatically in the big science picture, or as a mariner, it's quite different. If ice exists, it is a massive risk multiplier. Now, from this single chart, this is a Russian chart, and you'll notice it's 2016, but I want to point out here that what we're seeing is from the third week of August in 2016, the period that was least ice historically, we can see that considerable ice still exists, particularly up towards the Baffin coast, or the Point Barrow coast. The mariner has got to be aware of when that stuff is moving. When we look at it this closer on September 18th of that year, we can see that ice held right against Point Barrow, blocking that off for everything except heavy icebreakers. This is September 18th, when it should have been open. It should have been open 150 to 200 miles north of Point Barrow. But because the ice is lighter in a gross climatic sense, it was able to move down and block any ship movement through the period when your average super yacht would have said, end of September, good to go. It's not. The variability is what we have to look at. We see here in 2018, moving a little further east, if we look to the left of this again is a period of least ice in the Central Northwest Passage. But we see a whole bunch of red in that one section in Peel Sound that is what you got to get through to do a Northwest Passage. Again, shipping was blocked on this section here, except for heavy icebreakers. Here we are just a couple of weeks later. This should have been clear as a bell through that period. But the freezing had already continued and totally blocked off Peel Sound in that period than most would operate through. 2021, we saw something similar, where the central coast of the Northwest Passage was blocked to anything but icebreakers during the period when it should have been free. Looking here in 2024, we can see that the remnants of that tongue of ice coming down to Point Barrow still existed. But this particular image was, again, at that week period. Normally the ice would be several hundred miles, but this stuff right in the middle was causing concern if it closed down. So that's the kind of stuff we have to be aware of. We have to be aware that there are persistent choke points. These are the areas where ice is going to be an issue. We're not seeing ice-free summers. We are seeing less ice. We are seeing variable ice. But the problem is it still remains in those areas like Peel Sound, which is the classic stopper of anything through the Northwest Passage. McClintock Channel, heavy multi-year ice. Dolphin and Union Strait can get an ice plug, but it's not so troublesome. McClure Strait, usually blocked by heavy multi-year ice, and then the Beaufort Sea, where the gyre pulls it down. Simpson Strait is green because it tends to always melt out quite early and stay reasonably ice-free through the navigational season. This would be the route that most pleasure yachts and smaller vessels would choose to go through. Because it is ice-free, you don't go through the McClintock, but it is draft limited. draft limited to 7 meters. Anything over 7 meters is going to bottom out. But you still have to get there. So if you're coming from the east, you have to come through the ice belts and Peel Sound and McClintock Channel. If you're coming from the west, you have to get by that Beaufort Sea. Excuse me. In Russia, they too have their own ice blocks. So the northern sea route, the Novaya Zemlya is very unpredictable, no matter what they say. That's why the Russians have built massive PC2, PC3, 170,000 cubic meter liquefied natural gas icebreakers, more powerful in themselves than Canada's most powerful icebreaker, to get through this. Severnaya Zemlya, again, is an area that you've got to go through that narrow area because the pack persists north of the Severnaya Islands. And again, over Novosibirsk is another area. That Novosibirsk area is where the ships were trapped last year coming through for 2 weeks. So what do we got to look at with some of the challenges? Well, the Polar Code is of course, now the overarching regulatory framework put in place by IMO that is enabled by amendments to SOLAS, STCW, Standards of Training and Watchkeeping, and MARPOL. The Polar Code in itself is not an instrument, quote unquote, but it is enacted by these amendments to these other 3 standalones. It covers the construction and operating of ships, crews, and polar ops. And at this point, applies specifically only to vessels under STCW and SOLAS. However, that's going to be changing. It requires ships to be issued with a polar ship certificate, which confirms that the vessel meets the requirements for the Polar Code, and it identifies a category of capability for the ship. The ships are required to have specific polar waters operations manuals, which are great detailed management and operational manuals, procedure manuals on what to expect and how to deal with polar operation. And in conjunction with the STCW side of things, it puts in very solid requirements for training and certification of ships' bridge officers. What is very interesting is very recently, IMO and signatory flag states have all moved in favor of extending the Polar Code applicability beyond the SOLAS vessel, and that's where the super yachts come in. This quote, taken straight from it, Canadian Transport Canada, it will apply to pleasure yachts of more than 300 gross tons not engaged in trade. That is a real big game changer. So it's not like only some of the things will apply. It will be applied against those vessels. Now, the application date is yet to come in, but Canada has made it clear that these recommended guidelines will become mandatory for vessels that meet these requirements. Target of implementation right now is the 1st of January 2026 for new vessels and 1st of January 2027 for vessels constructed before 1st of January 2026. Regardless of the coming into force of the extension of Polar Code to pleasure yachts, at this time, Transport Canada is conducting what they call an enhanced oversight, and they are watching vessels that would normally be only covered by Polar Code in the commercial cargo or commercial operating sense. But anything that carries people as a cargo, whether it's a pleasure yacht or a cruise or expedition ship. Besides the IMO regulations, the other piece that you have to run through is, particularly if you're doing more than just a single nation cruise, is you've got to be aware of the various countries. Each of the coastal states, particularly in the Arctic, have enforced or put into place their own regulations to apply Polar Code requirements. Some are a little bit different. Canada and Russia are fairly stringent. Denmark has just recently, this past year, stepped up and put in place much, much tougher requirements for ships entering their waters than had been the case up until last year. United States, quite honestly, a little bit behind on how it's enforcing polar code and what it feels is necessary. Um, and around Svalbard, Norway, absolutely. Another one of the high regulatory impacted areas. The next piece, and the reason that this is blank is because this would be 10 slides. Regional territorial agency regulations and requirements. Um, it this part of the thing is so detailed and it's changing constantly. It's an ever-changing side of thing. And if we just look at Canada alone, the number of agencies that have guidelines, rules, prohibitions, protections in place above and beyond commercial shipping regulations, above and beyond IMO is mind-numbing. You've got to be on top of your game and in following this. Transport Canada and Coast Guard put together a manual a number of years ago that attempted to collect together every different agency that one would have to contact and get permission from or advise in order to make a passage. This can, or these can apply to pleasure craft, super yachts, whereas commercial regulations don't. And it catches operators off guard. They come through thinking, yeah, we're a pleasure yacht. We don't have to meet. Oops. Suddenly they find themselves afoul of a no entry zone. They're not permitted into an area because of wildlife or even cultural sensitivities. This is a huge part of us trying to assist the people as a cargo sector through the Northwest Passage. The next piece that we have to look at, and I think it's what is important when it's a new player, is how are they looking at this? And these are pieces that I did for a presentation to a major P&I club in the UK. One of their largest sectors is the super and mega yacht sector for insurance. And they were noting a rather unsettling increase in damage to some of their client vessels. So we did a presentation to them and saying, okay, this is what you have to look at when you're going through. That plastic yacht that is just fine in the Mediterranean or wherever. Is it actually going to come out on the top of the water after encountering ice? You want to know, does the vessel have an ice class, or what is the limit of the ice class? Is it very, very minor? There is an ice class that was put in place a number of years ago by one of the classification societies that an owner came to us and said, look, we want to do the Northwest Passage. We have this ice class vessel. This classification society says it's ice class this. And I'd never seen it before. Went to our contacts in the ice class, and basically I was laughed at. And they said, oh, that is E, whatever the number was, for Europe. It was put in place as a very, very low ice class for vessels transiting ice-impacted European rivers. That was it. And it was virtually a non-ice class. So is the ice class of your vessel intended suitable for the intended voyage? What does it work and how does it work? And you got to look at stuff like, I just put one piece of equipment that usually comes up where someone says, oh, we need searchlights, and they've got a couple of little things there. Nope, you've got to have the right equipment. You've got to have the right people, and you got to have the ship that can do it. Planning is absolutely vital. You can't just turn around and say, I just read the New York Times. I want to go through and see some polar bears and then take off. You still have reporting requirements. You still have to look at the risks. If you're smart and you're going to put on board an ice specialist, if it's too late in the season, everybody's working. You won't get them. You need to pre-plan. You need to get everything ready. You need to do the voyage risk assessment, and you update it. That's what your insurers are going to look for. Right off the bat, your insurance is going to go higher as soon as you're north of 60. So how do we look at this? Well, it really is still a place that's only easy or comfortable for the usual players. That's because it's still challenging. Just because there's no ice, that isn't the only problem. Why is it expeditionary? Well, because the risks are still there to make it a liner system. We couldn't possibly say, I'm going to leave Vancouver on this date and arrive in Halifax on that date, because you will be delayed, deferred, deviate for ice. Big pieces of this. The infrastructure in the Northwest Passage is very, very light. It's remote. It's just small villages. Regardless of what the government announced decade ago about Nanisivik, future site of Canada's deepwater port, it's still not open. They still haven't provided any fuel. And when Nanisivik does open, it will only be available to fuel Canadian Coast Guard ships and Canadian Navy vessels. So when you go into the Arctic and the Northwest Passage, you have to be prepared to have everything with you before you go. There's nothing between Dutch Harbor and Nuuk for resupply. The Russian side, though it has some cities, remote cities, a little bit more infrastructure west of Norway, between Norway and Novaya Zemlya, it's all focused around the oil and gas projects. There is a heavy commitment to provide icebreakers over there, but you pay a premium price. The average price for icebreaking service going through the Northern Sea route before the Ukrainian crisis began was in the area of $400,000 US just to get an icebreaker. And you also have to navigate a massive complex bureaucracy. At this point, we are not operating in the Northern Sea route at all. It's just too difficult to deal with making sure we don't run afoul of any of the sanctions. Lack of infrastructure also means in the Antarctic, there are no shipyards. They are research stations. There are no research, or they are only research facilities. You go down to that beautiful place where all the big ships and the Antarctic Peninsula, you've got to be prepared to come through the Drake Passage and not get the shit beat out of you by the weather and get down there. Nothing's going to help you out. So again, it's lack of anything. Search and rescue, absolutely. In 2010, the Arctic Council got together and they all agreed on carving up the Arctic, as an example, into SAR response zones. Well, this is all great. We're all responsible for those SAR zones, but what's happened? Canada has not appreciably increased any capability of search and rescue in its Canadian Arctic zone. You know, in my years up to 2013, we were trying. We still haven't got a new icebreaker built. We bought a couple of old ones. The air resources, the Royal Canadian Air Force resources, are based well in the south, and in the case of rotor wing, can take up to 24 hours to be positioned up into the north. They don't pre-position anything. The United States, in their Arctic Shield operation, the U.S. Coast Guard positions a helicopter from Kodiak up to Nome area, but nothing in Barrow. U.S. Coast Guard has only one ship operating routinely in the Arctic, and that's a Healy, and it's a research icebreaker. They've been able to send up a couple of their white ships and a couple of their black hulls for open water, but they're not icebreakers. Denmark has no icebreakers. They have a contract with Greenland Air to provide helicopter research. A Danish naval vessel, small corvette, small frigate size, is usually in the area, but it's lightly ice strengthened. Iceland is basically ice free. It's not a worry. Norway, a little bit better. The area around Svalbard is one of the best served for search and rescue, but it's a very short circle around there. The Russians, they've got their nuclear icebreakers. They are the most committed to providing a search and rescue capability. They have increased their footprint in 10 different search and rescue stations along the coast, putting in place rotor wing and fixed wing assets as well as their icebreakers. So right now, if you could go up there, when you call for help, you're likely to get help quicker in Russian Arctic than anywhere else. When we look at how Russia's done it, I love this slide because it shows that they've got 3 marine rescue subcenters covering their Arctic. Canada's Rescue Coordination Center operates out of the south, and it's just one. The U.S. Coast Guard Arctic Shield I already talked about. We don't pre-position any assets. They are really at the limit of any capability. The same thing is true in the Antarctic zone. The zones are there, but there are no assets at all based in Antarctica. There are no government ships tootling about waiting to help like there are in the Canadian Coast Guard Arctic operation. You are totally on your own, and you have to expect a long time for rescue. Charts, absolutely. We're getting an awful lot better, but I'm just going to fly through this one. Everybody relies on ENCs to some degree, but particularly in the high Arctic, they're not complete yet. Even through the Canadian Arctic, there are still some gaps, so you have to rely on paper charts. If you're using paper charts, you've got to be aware of the differences in polar mnemonic and typical Mercator charts. It's not the same thing. There's an awful lot of white area without any soundings whatsoever, both in the Russian and the North American Arctic. Shipping focuses in more often traveled areas or corridors where the surveying is a little bit more complete. And if you try to go outside those zones, corridors, you are likely to come to grief. Thing you got to have here, and this is for the owner side of things, is you've got to have the most up-to-date paper and electronic charts. It's not something, well, I had them last year. As the surveys are gradually being improved and modernized, it's important to get the best. Have multiple fixing devices. Relying on a single GPS will be the worst possible thing you could do. Commercial ships are required to have 2 gyros, not just one, and they have to be capable of operating right to the pole. Certain types of gyros, depending on how they are built, whether they hang or suspended from the bottom or the top, can have issues. Overemphasize, yeah, but stay to the well-protected corridors. Icebreakers, we all hear about Russia having 40 plus icebreakers. Somebody always comes out, but the bottom line is they don't have this massive fleet of 40 ships at the beck and call of everyone. Yes, they've got the 6 nuclear ships and they've got more than 6 conventional. Yes, they are aggressively renewing their icebreaking fleet, but they are there because Russia firmly understands that if they don't have icebreakers, they won't be able to export the only product they have of bringing in foreign cash. So the icebreakers are focused on supporting the export of hydrocarbons and natural resources. Right now, the United States only has the 2 capable polar icebreakers. The Healy was not designed to support shipping. It was designed to be an independent icebreaker to do science. It's not so great at breaking a path for someone to follow it. The remaining polar class, the Polar Star, is dedicated to the Antarctic, and though it's absolutely an amazingly capable ship, it's in its refit period for Arctic operations and is focused solely on Antarctic resupply of McMurdo. If they can move forward, they at least are looking at 3 massive polar security cutters and 6 smaller Arctic cutters. Canada says it commits to 6 icebreakers every summer, but every year it's hit and miss. There might be 4 in the region or 5 in the region at any given day. This year they said, oh, we're going to send 8 icebreakers, but they had to break that down into how many are actually in the Arctic on that given day. And the most they could put operational for this year was 5. Though the 2 polar icebreakers are ordered, they were ordered when I was still in the Coast Guard. We did the plans in 2009. We still haven't cut steel. Communications is the other piece. If you're relying purely on geostationary systems like Inmarsat and VSAT, you'll see from the diagrams here that their windows, their coverage windows, have gaps right in the middle of the northern sea route and right in the middle of the Northwest Passage. You have to have something better. Iridium Next has been around for quite some time. It's pretty good, but it's still fairly narrow band, still slow, but it does have coverage to the pole. The game changer recently has, of course, been SpaceX's Starlink. It has enabled broadband connectivity throughout the Northwest Passage. It's still geofenced around Russia, so you can't get it there, but it's something that I would highly recommend, that the systems be put on board vessels and the equipment and a service agreement is in place. Because often operators will buy a piece of kit and they'll buy the cheapest service agreement, and then they find out that, it's not going to cover them through the Northwest Passage because that's an extra cost, yada, yada, yada. The ultimate fallback in communications is the GMDSS, Global Marine Distress and Alerting System on SAT-C, which is the ultimate fallback. And then the final piece, really, that catches an awful lot of people off guard is the insurance. As soon as you go into the red zones, these are not covered by standard insurance, and it doesn't matter what you want to do. As soon as you go into one of these zones, if you haven't advised your insurer, your insurance is either null and void, or the cost goes up. It's a huge piece that gets lost by most yacht owners. So how do we deal with it? Well, you've got to make sure you've got the right crew and experienced crew. A Polar Code certificate of proficiency does not indicate that an individual is an ice navigator. It only means they've got a certificate on their license that says they've done a course in basically the academics of operating in polar waters. There are no time requirements to have ice time to get a COP for Polar Code, and that's why ice navigators are important. Ice navigators have Polar Code training and experience, and all of these shots, it's us working with various clients, whether it's cargo, whether it's passenger, or whether it's research ships. When we meet these requirements, it's important that it's not just Polar Code for the shipment itself, but the crew. And that's why the commercial ships will always have now a certain number of their people with the certificate of proficiency. They are also hedging their bets, and insurers are requiring them to carry ice navigators as well. The people who have the experience and have the licensing to carry on. Our team, Martech Polar, is a privately owned company, and we are unique in that we have a global footprint. None of our competitors in this field, and there are very few of them, have the same global footprint we have. all of our ice navigators are master mariners or STCW 3,000 ton or above. So that covers any super yacht that would ever be operating. We all hold Polar Code Advanced certification, and we're all Nautical Institute Ice Navigator Level 2. It's the Ice Navigator Level 2, which is the proof of experience and capability in ice. And that's the gold standard in the world. There is no other international standard for training. We have years of experience in ice navigation and operational services. We also provide subject matter expertise and expert witness services and insurance calls and insurance arbitrations, where we get a very good view of where the weaknesses are. When something goes sideways and there are now claims in arbitration or court, when we're brought in to provide that expert view of what went right and what went wrong, it's pretty interesting. It's very sobering to see how many operators have ventured forth into the polar waters quite blind and ignorant. We also provide voyage and mission planning expertise, and we do an awful lot of work working with developing the operational assessments and polar waters operations manual required on polar ships and soon to be required on yachts. So when we've got all of these pieces, we've got extended ice experience. What we do is we pick from our team the person who is best fitted for any particular voyage. You could imagine that I've got some folks that they do very, very well on a 70,000 ton bulk cargo carrier carrying iron ore. They're wearing blue jeans and a t-shirt on the bridge, but they don't have quite the same diplomatic ability that might be necessary on a super yacht or an expedition ship. So we match the people. It's one of my challenges. That it's not a negative challenge. It's a positive challenge where I can say yes, I've got people. Captain Victor Grandmeyer on the left, Captain Hannah Kudrell in the center, and Captain Fia Westland. These are 3 of the 25 people that we've got. Actually, it's almost 30 this year, all over the world that we can call upon to operate on a ship. And that is what I was hoping would set the stage for any further questions that you might have, and I'll figure out how to stop the show.
Well, Duke, thanks for that super interesting fly through. Yeah, we'll open the floor.
Yeah, maybe I can jump in with a comment first. Some of us work in deep ocean instrumentation here, and we all often tell people what we do is really, really difficult. And then I hear you speak, and I'm going, couldn't you have found a little bit of an easier occupation? Navigating the hazards is one thing, but then navigating all this bureaucracy, holy smokes, Duke, that was impressive to hear all that.
It can be very, very daunting, and to be right up honest, my personal preference would be never to do a passenger ship or yacht ever again, because the complexity is so much greater with those ships. But no, that's what we do. Our whole thing, and it's our mantra. It's our trademark. We are about safety, and it's my company, and I've collected together a bunch of people who are all dedicated to number one, absolutely safety. Our job is to stand up and say, no, that's a stupid idea to go there. You're going to sink your ship. It's not worth it. And there are some operators that don't like that, to be told no. But if you're hiring us, we're coming as the ultimate safety valve to make sure you don't turn left and go into the middle of a whale hunt and then be the subject of a court case and everything else. we're going to make sure that we don't take your ship where it's not suitable to go. But it's constantly changing what affects the smaller vessels out there, because they are the sector that have sadly proven themselves least prepared and most likely to do the wrong thing because they haven't got the right people and the right experience on board. So coastal states are cracking down, and that's why the Polar Code is being extended out, as I mentioned, to the non-SOLA sector.
So, kind of a curiosity question: how often are you seeing, for lack of a better term, like pleasure cruises, sort of through these areas? You know, where you might have some people go on a specially designed cruise ship or something, and then cruise through the Northwest Passage. How often does that typically happen? I assume not very often.
Actually, I'll start by saying we first lumped the sector into what we call people as a cargo, where the cargo can talk back at you. And then that is sub-split into fee-paying passenger vessels, commercial vessels, expedition ships, large passenger vessels, that sort of thing. And then the pleasure craft side, the yacht side. The frightening thing is we are seeing more ill-prepared yachts that can be 100 meters or more, suddenly appearing in waters where they could be impacted by ice, literally and figuratively. The cruise ship sector, I'll put all cruise and expedition together. Of course, everything went dead stop in COVID, but there's a fairly extensive cruise and expedition ship business in Baffin Bay and Davis Strait and in the Eastern Canadian Arctic. There are a number of Northwest Passage voyages by the commercial passenger sector, but because most of them are fairly low ice class, they tend to focus in a very narrow period in September period with at least ice season. But that whole Greenland and Eastern Canadian Arctic is busy. Svalbard, very busy, but likely to get less so because there have been some very recent changes to the requirements there because of issues. What had been concerning to SAR in particular, search and rescue, was the number of yachts that were just showing up. And that's why there's been a crackdown on that. I've got all sorts of amazingly horrid stories of a yacht coming into a small community and buying out the local store of anything that was just flown in that day for the local villagers, and just buying it up and going. Total ignorance to the impact on a community that was the airplane that came in for this month with whatever vegetables we were going to get, and they're gone. That's extreme, but it's a lack of awareness, a lack of sensitivity to the cultural aspects. Roaring in and disturbing whales and doing that sort of thing. That extreme is out there. For the most part, we see that people, I think, are coming through, and certainly the ones that we actually get on board. I think just the fact that they've hired us to come on board shows they've got a concern. But it's the ones that we see from afar that are an issue.
Duke, I think I remember from one of the other presentations at the Nautical Institute conference that like some numbers of pleasure yachts coming through the Northwest Passage was something like on the order of like 16 last year or in the last 2 years, and then like 9 in like 3 years ago or 4 years ago. But so it's not like overwhelming numbers, but it's also growing rapidly, right? And
Yes.
do those numbers kind of sound like reasonable in terms of the Canadian Arctic?
Oh, absolutely. And I think they're very, when you talk about a low number and a high number, years change. And the numbers change, and sometimes it can be just a particular article in National Geographic, and everybody says they want to come through, so we get a flurry of vessels coming up. But we're not seeing more than 50, is what I usually answer. We're seeing less than half of 50 going through the Northwest Passage. And sometimes what we see is somebody starts up and they find out, oh, crap, we can't make it all the way through. And they turn and go back. So the numbers you're looking at, are transit numbers that have gone from one end to the other, and it takes a certain chutzpah to do a transit on a small vessel. You've got to have the capability. And a very good friend of mine, Frank Cole, um, when he retired as a major shipping company CEO, bought himself a Nordland vessel. I think I'm going to say a 35-meter boat. I couldn't be exactly right, but he came to me and he said, Duke, we want to go through the Northwest Passage. I said, well, you come to the right guy. And we sat down and here it is. This is what you got to do. You've got to have this much fuel because you're not going to get fuel from here to here. You've got to have the capability of this much food on board because you're not going to get it. You've got to be prepared that if you get stopped, can you turn around and come back, or do you have to winterize the vessel somewhere in the middle of nowhere? These are the bits and pieces that have to be taken into consideration when it's a small pleasure craft, as opposed to, what we're seeing more and more in the expedition side of things since COVID is, the days of non-ice class expedition ships are almost virtually over. Anything that is going up there now, or down to the Antarctic as an expedition ship, at least has a PC6 or a PC5 rating, ice class, because the risks are too great to be less ice class than that, and operating other than that, those 2-week windows when it's the least ice season. So it's incremental increases in traffic, but not dramatic.
Super interesting, Duke. We're past 5 p.m. here, so maybe I will give someone the opportunity to ask one more question, and then we'll kind of try and wind her down. Tom, you want to go? Oh, you're just muted.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering, you were talking about some of the problem areas that you were having. I'm not thinking about the administrative and regulation stuff. I'm more thinking about the operational and technical side of things here. But so, for example, in communications, you said Starlink is now a game changer. It's helping provide communications up there now. Are there other sources of operational and technical pain that you guys are seeing that could use technical solutions?
I think the architecture of ships, if you will, and the capability of building a platform, we've got that. It's the ice capable designs are out there. You just have to pay more for it. Whether it's a yacht or whether it's a cargo ship, to make it ice class, it takes basically more steel, more framing. It does all that. We've got all sorts of very good hydrodynamic studies. We know how to design a vessel to work in the ice. The propulsion systems are up there. And technologically speaking, the mechanics of putting a ship through ice infested waters, we're at a peak. Never say never, but I don't know what else we can do there. The challenges around that are more soft challenges, the communications challenges. The communications one had been the biggest one of all for many, many years. When I was young and had red hair, we left in July, came back in October, and once we got north of 74, we were on our own. We couldn't talk to anybody unless we had a ham radio, because satellites just don't go high enough. So the biggest challenge is getting that connectivity. We need the connectivity just to do our day-to-day sort of thing. And the other piece is people. It's the people that need to be experienced in the area.
Awesome, guys. Well, maybe we'll just all thank Duke here for giving us an amazing overview, a snapshot of what it's like to operate in the poles.
Fascinating presentation. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
My pleasure. Anytime, if you guys want to ask questions afterwards, my email's out there, and I might be slow answering if I'm out at sea somewhere, but I will answer.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Duke. And to everyone, I guess have a good summer, because this is the last talk for until the fall.
Thanks very much
Thanks
for the
very much,
invitation.
Leslie.
For the good weather, everyone.
Bye.
That was great. Thanks,
Yeah,
Duke.
that
Have a
was
good evening,
thoroughly
guys.
enjoyable, Duke.
Take care, all.